Record. Well, okay, so good evening everyone. Week 6 of the medical ethics course. I've had a lot of feedback. Thank you all for those of you who sent feedback. The consensus is that it goes on too long and you're all exhausted at the end of it. Well, you're not the only ones. The problem is that I have tried to cram in a year's course into 8 weeks. Really, each of these topics that we're doing is a course in itself. So I will try and shorten the sessions, but by definition, thereby, we will be sacrificing detail. Those of you who come to my other shiurim will know that I am a bit of a stickler for detail. And just to give you an idea of those of you that don't, we have been doing Gemara Sanhedrin for exactly a year, and we have done 6 pages. So that's how much detail we go into in that. So we're going to sacrifice a bit of detail by shortening the sessions, but I will try to do that in the following way. I'm not going to go through the course material that I sent out, or that Avril sent out a couple of days ago in any great detail. I'm just going to give a summary of it and go through it very quickly. It's there for you to read at your leisure, and anybody that wants further details can email me and I can point you in the direction of further details for that. One of the other pieces of feedback was that you wanted to know the halachic issues before you went in to discuss the cases. Well, I'm not going to do that because that would be pointless, because all you then do is read the bits of the halachic information that I've given you. The whole idea of the breakout rooms before that is for you to think about it yourselves, and then when we go through the halachic stuff, to see whether what you actually said and thought yourselves is reflected in the halacha, or whether there's other things that you perhaps hadn't thought of. So, but what I will do is to give more time to the halachic side of things and less time to the course material that I've sent out ahead of time. And that thereby we will speed up a bit and hopefully not all be too knackered at the end of it. Okay, so tonight's topic is assisted reproductive technologies, or assisted reproductive techniques, depending on which of the initials you want to, how you want to describe the initials. ART is how it's referred to in the literature. I'm just going to share the screen for a minute or two. Okay. There we go. You see the screen? Yeah. So on the screen, you should see the highlights. Now, what I've done here is just to give you a very brief few ideas that we've got problems with in terms of ethics with assisted reproductive technologies. What do we mean by assisted reproductive technologies? We mean anything that we use to help infertile people. We used to say infertile couples, but actually that's not true anymore. It's infertile people to have children. And of course, the most famous of those, the most well-known of those techniques is IVF, in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, as they used to be called. First one having been in 1978, Louise Brown in Oldham Royal Hospital. And there are all sorts of different techniques which are used to help people have children. And the ethical issues that arise really on the whole spectrum of the procedure. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the procedures all of the procedures involve the production of a fetus somehow or another, and then the giving birth of a fetus somehow or another. And the problem that's causing the infertility can be at any of the various different stages of conception, gestation. So whatever the problem is, it has to be got around. So, for example, if you have a case where a man has to either try and find some sperm in his testicle knocking about there and then use that for IVF, or you have to find somebody else's sperm and use that, and that becomes a donor. Same thing for the eggs with the woman. Either a woman doesn't have quality eggs, or doesn't have any eggs, or doesn't have any ovaries, and that problem has to be got over either by donors or by various different techniques. So the problem can be in the actual availability to the couple of sperm and egg, or it can be a problem of getting the sperm and the egg to actually meet and fertilize. And sometimes what has to be done is you have to take them out of the body to do that. And that is the original sort of IVF, if you like. In vitro fertilization means that in vitro means in glassware, vitro, so in a test tube. You take the sperm, you take the egg, you mix them together, and they in a petri dish, and they fertilize, and then you put it back in the uterus. So it could be that problem. It could be that the woman is not able to carry a fetus. In other words, fertilization is okay. Implantation might be a problem. So a woman might have repeated miscarriages, and therefore we need to find another way of getting her baby, and that might be using a surrogate or gestational carrier. So in other words, like a human incubator. The problem may be in maintaining that pregnancy in terms of placental insufficiency, repeated late miscarriages, and again, surrogates might be used for that. So the whole process of making a baby is fraught with potential problems, and problems at any time along that timeline can be tried to be overcome with the various techniques that are available. Now, the problem is that it raises ethical issues, because it's a big business. I don't mean a big business money-wise. It's a kerfuffle to make these embryos. It's not a simple thing. It involves a lot of heartache for the couples. It involves a lot of visits to the clinic. It involves a lot of drugs to be taken to prepare the ovaries to produce the eggs, etc. And so what happens is you can't just do it every 5 minutes. So what you have to do is do a few of them at once. So you'll get a few embryos. And then what do you do with the ones that are left over? How many do you implant? That's one situation that we need to consider. Second thing, of course, or even probably the first thing, even before that, is the cost. Who's going to bear the cost of this? Is this something that should be provided by the state with a capital S? Is this something which is should be considered as a medical problem, and therefore if you have a medical services provider such as a Kupa in Israel, or a health insurer in America, or the NHS in the UK, should they be obliged to provide this kind of service? And if so, who is entitled to that service? Are private providers entitled to choose their customers? So in other words, if you had a homosexual couple that came and said, we want to have a baby, would it be ethical for the owners of that clinic, or the state, if we're talking about a state situation, would it be ethical for them to say, sorry, we're only dealing with heterosexual couples. And then if you say that that's okay, is it okay to say, I'm sorry, we're only dealing with people who've been married in holy matrimony, and we're not interested in people who are just living together? So you can see that there are all sorts of difficult decisions and questions that come into play. Once you've got your embryos, what are you going to do with the leftover ones? Who's going to pay to store them if you decide to store them? If you decide to, you're not going to use them, is it ethical to use them for somebody else? Can you then use somebody else's surplus embryos to implant into a third party with or without their knowledge? So these are all questions which need to be addressed in terms of the ethics around reproductive technologies. It's probably one of the biggest minefields in bioethics today. Is this concept of assisted reproductive technologies. And the reason for that is because it is a victim of its own success. Because over the last, 42 years, is it 42 years? Yes, 42 years since the birth of Louise Brown, the techniques have been improved, they have expanded, and there is so much more we can do. We can now do pre-genetic screening. So we can take an embryo and before it's implanted, we can check it to make sure that it doesn't have a particular genetic defect. So, for example, Ashkenazi Jews, as you will know, are have a very high proportion of people who have the BRCA gene, which is a gene which causes premature breast cancer and ovarian cancer. Now you can do pre-implantation genetic testing. So you can do IVF and you can make a whole bunch of embryos and you can check those and only then implant the ones which have not got the BRCA gene. So that means instead of having a 1 in 2 chance of passing on that faulty gene to your child, then you can say for sure that that child doesn't have the BRCA gene. So we can do all of that. So while we're doing that, what about other things? Genetic screening. What about sex selection? Is it ethical then, where either as part of a pre-implantation genetic screening and testing, while you're at it, say, oh, by the way, I'd like a boy, or by the way, I'd like a girl. So can we check that at the same time? Is that ethical? Is sex selection, which is entirely possible today with IVF, is that ethical at all? What about donors? What about the ethics of choosing your donor? So if you are going to a private clinic, is it acceptable ethically to say, well, I need a sperm donor, but I would like to have a Cambridge graduate who has a double first in philosophy and politics. I'd also like him to be 6'2" with blue eyes and blonde hair. And if he also has amazing talent at playing the piano, that would be a bonus, please. Are you allowed to do that ethically? And if you are allowed to do that ethically, are the clinics allowed to charge you more for the sperm of such a person than they would be able to charge you for the sperm of some lesser mortal, an ordinary person, as it were? So you can see that once you start to think about the mechanisms of assisted fertility, first of all, there's sperm, and there's eggs, and there's donation involved in that. And then there may be third-party involvement in terms of carrying the baby. So you'll have seen the cases that I put forward for you. What about who's the mother? And that's an important question because we'll get to the halacha later on. But even in sort of non-halachic terms, who the mother is extremely important, because I'm sure that you will all have heard of cases where a surrogate was employed to carry a baby for a couple, and then when the baby was born, the surrogate refused to hand over the baby and said, no, this is my baby. This baby's been nurtured by my placenta, by my blood, by my nutrition, and I'm not giving it up. And there have been legal battles, and these are very serious ethical questions which arise as a result of the ethics of assisted reproductive techniques. So there's all those kind of questions. And then there's the sort of umbrella question of who actually sets the rules. Should there be uniform rules in a country? Should there be uniform rules across the world? Should this be a World Health Organization issue? Or should it be left to individual countries or individual states? Or even individual clinics to make these decisions. And so these are all questions which need to be addressed. So if we have a look at, you can read all this stuff that I sent you at your leisure. We basically have got two approaches to look at carefully. One is two-party assisted reproduction. So that is a case where you don't involve a third party. It's a couple themselves, and they have to decide how they're going to approach their infertility. And we'll see when we come to the halachic side that in itself has problems. And then you've got the idea of drugs, the drugs that you give to women to stimulate their ovaries. You can end up having multiple pregnancies, triplets, quads, quins, and what's the ethics around that. So that's one issue. And of course, as we mentioned before, what do you do with excess embryos is a big problem. Is an embryo a human being? When does an embryo become a fetus? When does a fetus become a human being? And what are the ethics around discarding what some people would consider to be a human life right from conception? That's particularly the Catholic approach. So we've very briefly mentioned some of the problems there. And as you'll see, as I just whizzed through this thing on the screen, which you've got yourself, you can read the details about it. Then we come to the third party assisted reproduction. And that's where it gets even more complicated, because we're bringing in outside issues, whether it's sperm donation, egg donation, or gestational carrying donation. These are all things which will impact on the questions of ethics. And I've given you in this document here, these are some of the questions that are raised. And I think just before we stop for a moment, we should just go through these questions and look at them, because these are the important things that ethicists have to put their heads around and come up with some kind of policy and approach to it. So how should the law and policy recognize and weigh the significance of genes and gestation and establishing parental rights and duties? Now, what that means, of course, is that you have conflicting rights and conflicting desires. So the obvious one, of course, is the surrogate mother. She wants to keep the baby at the end of the day, but the mother who is employed the surrogate who's not carried the baby, may be the genetic mother, and therefore you've got two conflicting desires here, two conflicting rights. And as when we come to the halacha, you'll see that there are two conflicting holds, if you like, on the halachic status of motherhood. So again, who should benefit from this? Should there be a cutoff point in terms of age? Should it be only people who've not had children before, or is secondary infertility an appropriate use of resources? How many cycles should each couple be allowed on the state's bill? And what about same-sex couples, as we mentioned earlier on? What about single people that come along and say, well, I want to have a child, but I don't have a partner, so I can provide the sperm. I want you to provide me with the egg, or vice versa. It's usually the other way around. It's usually women more often than men that go to a clinic and say, I want to have a child, but I don't have a partner, and I want to have a sperm donation. And then, of course, there's the ethics around the rights of the child. Does the child, or should the child, have the right to seek out its biological parents? Or should the donors be allowed to be anonymous? You can imagine a situation in the olden days, back in the day before this was all regulated as much as it was. Most of the sperm donors, certainly in the UK, I can't speak for anywhere else, but certainly in the UK, most of the sperm donors were medical students. Partly because they were available to the clinics very easily, and partly because they gave them a few quid, and medical students were always claiming to be poor. So it was a win-win situation. They were nearby. I nearly said on hand then, but that was probably not a bit of a faux pas. And they were available, let's put it that way, to provide the specimen. And they weren't averse to having a few pennies put their way for doing so. So what you may well have had is that you may have found that these people may have sired, 20, 30, 40, 50, who knows how many hundred children may have been sired by one particular person. And if there was the ethics of saying, well, all of these people could suddenly come knocking at your door 20 years later, and you could have a whole street full of people who are coming to your door saying, oh, hello, Dad. You would then perhaps think twice about doing it, and then you would end up with a shortage of sperm donors. So there's that aspect of it. And then the conflicting ethical problem is, well, does a child have a right to know their biological father? On the face of it, you would say, well, that seems to me to be a fairly basic human right, to know who your biological father is, to know about the various, maybe even genetic problems that particular person might have, or his background, his characteristics, the family. Seems to me to be a fairly basic right for a person to know their biological father. But unless that is pointed out to the person right in the first place before they do their sperm donation or egg donation, in the case of the mother, you have a potential ethical conflict there. And of course, as we said right at the beginning of this course, the dilemma, the whole point of ethics is that you have a dilemma which needs to be solved. If it's not a dilemma, then it's not an ethical problem. And here, with assisted reproduction, the dilemmas are very, very clear cut, because there are often conflicting and mutually exclusive rights and responsibilities which conflict with one another. So that's really sort of a whiz through some of the issues that are raised by this problem. A few more on a slightly different angle here, a more sort of, if you like, seedy aspect to it. What about selling things like this? What about selling surrogate services? Is that appropriate? It all smacks a bit, it doesn't smell very nice, does it? Selling a kidney or selling the use of your uterus, rent a womb. It doesn't have a nice feel for us, because we're used to the idea of this kind of donation being, in fact, they use the word donation, don't they? What do we normally understand by the word donation? We all understand that is something given freely. When you go into the shops and you buy a loaf of bread, you don't donate the money to the shop. you are buying a loaf of bread. You wouldn't say, I'm donating 10 shekels here to the shop for a loaf, and in return I'm getting a loaf of bread. No, you're paying for that service. So the fact that we call it egg donation, or we call it sperm donation, by definition almost, we think of it as altruistic. But what are the ethics of selling that? There are some people, sadly, who are so poor in many in third world countries, who feel that the only way that they can actually survive is to sell bits of their body. There are people around the world, particularly in India, it's a big trade in India, who sell kidneys. And that's the only way they can support their family, is to sell a kidney. So is that ethical to sell your services as a surrogate mother, as an egg donor, or as a sperm donor? Is that an ethical thing to do? Is it something that we are just uncomfortable with, or is it something that should be forbidden? So the finances and the economics of this is another area of ethical dilemmas. And then here, this is an interesting little section here. I've put some questions in here. What about the nation state's approach to this? So the law, interesting, in Sweden, you are a donor is told right from the start that they will only be accepted as a donor if they are willing to be found by their biological child. Of course, that reduces the number of donors considerably. France, on the other hand, have taken a completely opposite view. And what they say is that all donations must be anonymous, and that's the other end of the spectrum. And therefore, the child has no right to go and find their biological parent, because the position is that they will be given no assistance by the state, let's put it that way, in finding their biological parent, because all donations are anonymous. Now, those are some of the questions that I've raised on a sort of whistle-stop tour through this, which really should take us weeks to go through. And if, by the way, if there is enough interest, and at the end of the course, we will send out an analysis sheet, which you could all fill in anonymously to say what you thought about the course. Part of that will be to see whether there is an interest to go into these subjects more deeply. So there may well be an opportunity for us to do a deeper analysis of these topics. But in the interest of brevity, and to try and satisfy those of you who fed back that it was too long, I'm going to stop there and stop for breath. I'm going to ask if there's any particular comments that you want to make now, before I ask you to go and think about the cases that I set you. And I want you to think about them both from a secular and a halachic point of view. And then I'm going to go and spend a significant amount of time going through the different halachic aspects of this, because unlike some of the topics that we've done so far, there is more divergence in halacha versus secular ethics in this topic than there have been in some of the others. It's been notable, I think, in some of the other topics that we've handled, is that at the end of the day, there has been quite a parallel between, not total parallel, but there's been a very significant parallel between Western ethics and the halachic approach. It's different with this. There are different angles here altogether in terms of the halacha. So before I split you all up and give you a chance to think about those things, is there anything that any of you would like to raise at this particular point? If so, then please put your hand up and I will see your hand up. Okay. Looks like, oh, there's Howard. Yes, Howard. You'll have to unmute. We can't hear you, Howard. There we go.
There's actually a wonderful French-Canadian film about a sperm donor who was confronted by, I think, about 120 of his children. If anyone can ever catch that movie, much better than the American repeat of it.
Can you remember the name of it?
I'll find it during this evening.
Okay, you find it for us. There was actually just on that particular point, and this is part of the ethics actually, because there was a chap. I can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was California, but I couldn't swear to that. Anyway, there was a chap running, or it might have been Belgium. Anyway, in somewhere there was a chap running a very top infertility clinic. And he got success he had a reputation for getting successful pregnancies using a technique of putting a syringe into the testicles of men who apparently had very low or no sperm count at all. And he had a very, very good success rate in this clinic. And he got a reputation, a worldwide reputation, for being the go-to guy for people with this particular problem. I can see Laura's smiling because she knows what happened in this. This guy, it turns out that somebody, after some time, noticed that all the kids that were born from this clinic had a startling resemblance to the director of the clinic, who happened to be a short, fat, ugly little fellow. And all these little kids that were born, or at least very many of them, had a startling resemblance to him. Anyway, cut a long story short, investigations were done, genetic investigations. And of course, he'd been cheating because instead of using the sperm from his patients that he had allegedly or supposedly taken from their testes, he was using his own sperm to inseminate the women, and needless to say, that clinic was closed down very quickly. But there's an ethical issue which has arisen because he had himself a fantastic reputation. It was a private clinic, no doubt. He made fortunes in doing this. People are very vulnerable in this scenario when they are desperate to have a child. They'll pay anything for a good success rate. And of course, you know, this fellow fell foul to his greed and did really an unforgivable thing. So that was an ethical dilemma that he had and clearly miserably failed. Yes, Howard?
Believe it or not, the movie was called Starbucks.
Starbucks.
Yeah, I'll put the link here now.
Okay, so put the link in and anybody can have a look at that if they want to. Thank you for that. Right, any other comments before we break up and listen to the and have a chat with amongst yourselves about the cases? Okay,
this
now
Sharon. Sharon has one.
Yeah. Yes, Sharon.
Yes, there's also a remarkable memoir written by a very fine memoirist named Donnie Shapiro called Inheritance. And it's a story of a very deeply Jewish woman from one of the finest families in New York, Orthodox families in New York City, when she does a 23andMe search and finds some questions that need to be asked. And it's a fascinating book, particularly from the perspective of her as a Jewish woman from a very prestigious New York family.
Okay, if you, Sharon, if you can put on the chat the name of that book for everybody, that will be great. Right, when you are thinking about these cases, I want you to try and think laterally. And I've given you a few clues by the questions that I've given. I want you to think laterally and think about all the potential pitfalls. You don't have to look at every case. I'm only going to give you 10 or 15 minutes so that we can try and keep it to a shortened program. Have a think about the whole concept. I don't even mind if you don't discuss the cases, but just discuss the issue. And we'll come back together in about 10 or 15 minutes. So we have our 45 people as usual. Where is, oh, I think you're going to have to do this, Avril. You're the host.
I have no idea how to do this.
Okay, so just make me the host then. Go into me and make me the host. And then I
Okay.
should be able to do it. Right, I should be able to do that. Now breakout rooms. Right, here we go. So I'm going to break you out into 10 rooms. So you should have between 3 and 5 people, depending who opts out and who doesn't get put in one, like Simon for some reason never gets put in a room. I don't know why. So here we go. Just click on join when you get the link, please, when you get the prompt to join. Okay, any of you who have not yet joined, is there anybody that wants to join that can't join, or have you all chosen not to join? Because if you want to join, I can probably try and join you. If you don't want to, that's also fine.
Johnny, it's Malcolm. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, my internet is intermittent at the moment. It has been through the whole session, so I just avoided going into the room because I won't be able to participate properly.
Right,
So
okay.
I'll just wait.
Okay, well, we won't be too long.
It's a shame. I enjoy the discussions, but I've had problems for the last few hours. Drive me nuts.
Well, you could pop in and join and see what happens. You might be all right.
I might try that. Okay. All right, I'll try.
Yeah, you're in a nice room actually. I can see who you're going to be with.
Johnny, can you put me in room 4 again? I tried to do it on my iPhone, but that's all I have is tap to speak. I don't have a video.
Oh, right. Okay, let me see if I can do that.
Maybe you have to close this one.
It just says your microphone is muted, but then I unmuted it and your video is stopped, and I have no idea why.
Okay, so I'll tell you what to do, Nachum. Come out of the meeting and rejoin.
Okay. Leave breakout room.
Yeah, leave the breakout room and then try and rejoin it.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'll get rid of this iPhone. Okay. Oh, hopefully that's gone. No, it's not gone. Oy vey. Wait, Let me get out of this.
Right, I'm going to do it for you, Nachum. You're going to go to 4.
Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Hi, Tat.
Hello. You all right, Dolly?
Yeah. Just painting.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to see
hi,
you.
Mum. Mummy, everyone can see you. Okay, draw.
What are you painting, Dolly? Right, I'm going to go and join in a room or two and see what's going on. Okay, while people are rejoining, I'll just, apparently my sound is not brilliant tonight for some reason. Some people in the chat have said they've not been able to hear me. I'm assuming that that's because my internet isn't brilliant for some reason. I don't know why. So I can only apologize for that. I suppose I could rejoin, but I don't think I will, because I think I'll probably knock you all out if I do that. So I think we're all back now. So let me first of all, perhaps, well, I think what we'll do is this way. We'll go through some of the halachic problems, and then we'll have a discussion between us about the various different cases. But if I go through the halachic material now, that means that those of you who want to leave won't miss anything other than the chat afterwards. So that's what I think we'll do now. So as I said to you earlier, this particular topic gives us more halachic problems than most. I was going to say probably than any other. And it probably is actually more than any other. Perhaps euthanasia, which we're going to do in the last 2 weeks, is also in that category. But I think probably there are more halachic problems with assisted reproductive techniques compared to the secular approach, if you like. In other words, the divergence of problems is greater, I think, in this subject than in any other. What I've prepared is a summary of the halachic issues, and I also have a much more detailed version. So I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to go through with you the summary version. You should be able to see that on the screen. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, so that's the one that we're going to go through now. That's the summary. There's this one as well, which is much more detailed with more sources and a much deeper sort of analysis of the situation. We're not going to have time to do that because of the brevity that we need to be with this. However, I will send that out to you when I send you the recording. And when I send you the summary, I will also send that out as well. And therefore, those who want to spend time, I know that some of you will want to get stuck into the material in a deeper way. You'll have plenty material there to go through. So hopefully that will satisfy both camps, those that want to do it in great depth and those that want to finish early. So let's go through the problems that we arise in the halacha. So as I said before, this whole process of reproduction starts with a sperm and an egg. So if we have a problem, let's start with the sperm. If we have a lack of sperm, in other words, the man of the couple is unable to produce either sufficient or sufficient quality sperm for reproductive purposes, then we have to get sperm either from him, centrifuge it down and concentrate it in it, so it's like, you know, like orange squash, really concentrated, so that the sperm is better quality. Or if he hasn't got any, then we have to get some from someone else, preferably not the director of the fertility clinic, preferably a donor who has agreed to be a donor and who's agreed that other people have agreed that he should be a donor. But either way, we've got to get some sperm. So how are we going to do that? Well, the simple answer is that you have to extract the sperm from the man. The simplest way of doing that is, of course, by ejaculating. So that means that a man has to ejaculate into a pot so that the semen which contains the sperm is then available. The difficulty is that it goes off very quickly. So you have to get it to the lab within a very short period of time. So what normally happens is that this procurement of sperm has to usually be done in the clinic itself. So it doesn't really lend itself to a particularly aesthetic situation here. But either way, you've got to get some sperm out. Now, you will be familiar, I'm sure, I think I've got this down here somewhere later on in here. Yes, you will be familiar with this story in Bereshit, the story of and Onan, the children of Yehuda. Was his firstborn. The psukim are on the screen there. Was the firstborn. He died. And then Yehuda said to his second son, Onan, that he had to do something called Yibum. Yibum is levirate marriage. We don't do it anymore. We do chalitza instead. That's another story for another day. The idea of Yibum is that in order to build up the name of the dead person, his brother, in other words, the brother of the dead person, has to then marry the widow. And Onan did that, but he was a bad man. And what he did, he says, I'm not going to have children with this woman because they won't be considered my children. They will be considered heirs' children. That's the whole point. So when it came to the act of intercourse here in verse 9, he spilled his seed, v'shichet, arza shichet, from destroy, the word to destroy. He destroyed his seed onto the ground. In other words, he ejaculated onto the ground. And then verse 10, what he did was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and Hashem put him to death. So it's a very serious isur dioraita to waste seed. It's called hotzat zera levatala, to take out seed, to produce seed levatala, for nothing. In other words, for no purpose. And it's a very serious isur dioraita, and therefore there are many rabbis who say that we have a problem with artificial insemination by sperm, because we've got to get hold of that sperm. How are you going to get it? You can only get it one way, and that way is forbidden. So there are many people, many conservative, I mean conservative with a small c, not conservative with a big C, many conservative rabbis who will say that is completely forbidden. The more modern approach is to say, no, you've misunderstood this whole thing. Hotzat zera levatala means exactly what it says on the tin, expressing seed levatala, for nothing. This isn't for nothing. The whole point of this is you're going to use that seed to inseminate and to have children. On the contrary, they would say, actually, this is the opposite of hotzat zera levatala. This is actually hotzat zera for a proper reason. So there's no problem with it. So there are many rabbis today who will permit the procurement of sperm for the purposes of artificial insemination by masturbation. That is now something which is fairly widespreadly permitted, not across the board. Many Haredi rabbis will still forbid it. The other way of getting sperm is by putting a needle into the testicle where the sperm is made and extracting some sperm or some sperm cells from the testes and using that. And you'll say, well, okay, that's much better because we don't have to do this onanism business. Well, actually, that's not any good either, because there is another isur in the Torah. I think I might have written it down here somewhere. Here we are. Lo yavo psuadaka okrut shafcha b'kal Hashem. A man with injured testicles or whose member is cut may not enter the assembly of the Lord. It's a halacha in Devarim, chapter 23, if you want to look it up. And it means that somebody literally with crushed testicles, it means an injured testicle. Now, those same rabbis that will say you can't procure semen by masturbation will also be the same rabbis that take the literal view of this pasuk and say any injury to the testicles, never mind that it's caused by a doctor at the end of a syringe, nevertheless, it is an injury to the testicle, and therefore that's called krust shavcha, and you can't do it, and they would forbid it. So you have an ever decreasing number of rabbis who find it problematic to get hold of the sperm at all. There is an ever increasing number of rabbis these days who are interpreting this in a more broad way, if you like, and saying that actually this is for reproduction, it is not levatala, and therefore it can be done. Right, that's the procurement of the sperm. Now, what about insemination? We know that there is also serious halachot of family purity, that a man and a woman cannot have intercourse during a certain period of the month, during the menstrual cycle, and for 7 days thereafter, where there has to be 7 days of counting. That's a period called nida. And what about insemination during nida? Well, you're going to say to me what Rabbi Moshe Tendler, a very famous posek, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, what he said very famously was, you cannot commit adultery at the end of a syringe. So basically what he was saying is that the act of insemination is not the act of intercourse. And therefore there is room for maneuver, if you like, that conception during nida would be acceptable in that situation because it's not considered intercourse. However, we do try to avoid it because there are certain sort of semi-Kabbalistic, mystical sort of approaches that say a child conceived during nida has some sort of pagam, some sort of negativity towards it. So if we can avoid that, we do so. But if we can't avoid it because the science and the hormonal balance, etc., means that it has to be done during a nida period, well, then there are enough opinions on which to rely on to say that that's okay. So that's simple. Now, what about things like IVF and Xe? Xe is where a sperm is injected directly into the cell. IVF is where they're put into a test tube and they mix naturally. It's the same idea. Sperm and an egg come together in a test tube. Doesn't matter whether you actually put it in or it goes in itself. The bottom line is it's done in a test tube. So supervision is very important. You would not want to eat in a restaurant or an eatery which didn't have rabbinic supervision to make sure that everything was kosher as it should be. And it's the same with a fertility clinic. The rabbis insist that there is supervision. What are we supervising? It doesn't matter if they're kosher. No, of course not. We're not talking about kosher eggs. We're talking about making sure that Reuven's sperm is really Reuven's sperm and not Shimon's sperm. And that Leah's egg is really Leah's egg and not Rachel's egg, because we've got all sorts of issues if we get them all mixed up. So it's a very, very important thing. And in many places, supervision is absolutely insisted upon. Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, for one, has a very, very state-of-the-art, really, really top-notch fertility unit. And there, everything is done under halachic supervision with highly trained people there doing the supervision. I know of one particular lady who started life off as a supervisor in that clinic and is now a double PhD embryologist herself and is now actually making the babies herself, which is a brilliant story. She started off as a shomeret, and now she is now a fully blown embryologist making babies in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. And kol hakavod to her. Okay, so next question is, what do we do with the surplus embryos? Is it halachically permissible to throw them away, destroy them? Or are we not allowed to do that? In other words, if we're not allowed to do that, then we're only allowed to make the amount of embryos that we're going to implant. Well, the problem with that is that the number of embryos that will be successful is not necessarily very high. So if you say, well, I'm only going to implant 2 because I don't want to have more than twins, you might then make 2 embryos, and those 2 embryos might not survive, and so therefore you've not got any. So generally speaking, what's done is you might make 5 or 6 embryos, which means that you've got a few in store in case the first lot don't work, in case you implant it and it doesn't work. There's only a success rate of whatever the percentages of that clinic particularly. But then you've got a problem of what do you do with them? Are these things considered halachically people? Do we take the Catholic view, which says that life begins at conception, and therefore the Catholic view is that you could not destroy an embryo? It is that's like murder as far as they're concerned. The halachic view is that there is a difference. It's not nothing. We can't treat these embryos as if they're just mere bits of rubbish. They're not. But until 40 days after conception, there is a halachic concept of Gestation, which doesn't come on until 30 days after birth, but there is a progression of Gestation. So up to 40 days before conception is the lowest level of life, if you like. 40 days from conception onwards is a higher level of life. After birth is another higher level of life. And after 30 days, one has what's called a complete Gestation. The bottom line halacha across, more or less across the board, of course, you're always going to find some people who will forbid it, but more or less across the board, it is halachically permissible to preserve the embryos for future use, and it is also permissible to destroy them with bekavod in a manner that's befitting for a human tissue. So that's an issue which has been dealt with by the halachists. Now, what about here? We can't start to come now to the more difficult issues, which is the donation of eggs and surrogacy, because now we're getting into the realms of who does this child belong to. So these are some of the cases that I set for you to talk about now. So you have an egg donation where you have an egg donated by a woman A, and it is then mixed with the sperm of the husband of woman B. So genetically, the parents are the man and woman A. And then woman B has this embryo implanted into her. She has no genetic material. As it so happens, that's not actually true anymore. We think that there is a small amount of genetic material is passed in from the carrier mother, but let's for the moment say there isn't much, at least, if any. So you have the genetic material of woman A inside woman B, and woman B then gives birth to the child. So genetically, the mother is woman A, but woman B has carried this child and has given birth. So who is the mother? Halachically, who is the mother? That's a question. What does it matter? Well, it does matter because you've got issues of kibud avvein, a mitzvah from the Torah, not only a mitzvah from the Torah, a mitzvah from the 10 Commandments. You have a issue of inheritance. You have an issue of Jewish status. So if woman A is not Jewish and woman B is Jewish, is this child Jewish? A Jewish woman has given birth to this child, but genetically, this woman has, this child has the genetic material of a non-Jewish woman. So what's the Jewish status? And thirdly, importantly, what about Yichud, the laws of Yichud? If that child is a male child, and if you say that the mother who rears that child is not the mother. So in other words, let's say the child is given birth by woman B and lives with woman B until he gets married and he's in the house with that woman B, but actually woman B is not halachically his mother. Then you've got an issue of yichud, of the forbidden status of a man and a woman being alone together. So that's another halachic issue which needs to be considered. So it does matter who the mother is, apart from the obvious thing that it matters, because what if woman A says, well, actually, I'm not giving you this child back. It's my child. Does woman B have any right halachically on the child? So these are the questions we need to look at. So what does the halacha say? Well, you'll be pleased to know that you can pay your money in it and takes your choice, because there are opinions everywhere. There's an opinion that says the genetic mother is the mother. There's an opinion that says the birth mother is the mother. And beautifully, there is an opinion that says the child has two mothers, that both of them are the mother. Increasingly, as I said earlier, this is a moving feast, this whole halachic issue of assisted fertility, because it's such a modern problem. Increasingly, the poskim, the modern poskim, are coming down on the side that there are actually two mothers, that both the birth mother and the genetic mother have the status of a halachic mother, and therefore on the status of kibud avain, the child would have a chiyuv, an obligation midoraita from the Torah to be mechabed both mothers. In terms of Yerusha, they would have that child would have a share of the Yerusha of each mother. In terms of the Jewish status, well, you might end up having a half Jewish child. What are you going to do with that? Well, of course, what you're going to do with that is you're going to do geirut lechumra. That child will go through a conversion process lechumra, meaning that we don't really know. And so just to be on the safe side, to be sure, the child will go through a process of geirut. That's just some of the issues of the mother. Now, what about the issue of forbidden relationships, of a mamzer? A mamzer, as you know, is the product. It's not a bastard as in use in the English language. A bastard in the English language means a child born out of wedlock. A child, a Jewish, in halacha, a child born out of wedlock is not necessarily a mamzer. A mamzer is a child born of a forbidden relationship, any forbidden relationship. We tend to use it mostly in the terms of eshet ish. So in other words, a married woman, a woman who is married to a Jewish man, who then has a baby through relationships with another Jewish man, that child is a mamzer. But it's not only that scenario, it's any of the forbidden marriages. So a brother and a sister, a father and a daughter-in-law, all those forbidden marriages that we read on the afternoon of Yom Kippur in Laning, all of those, the products of those relationships are called a mamzer. Now, what about this? You have a scenario whereby the sperm donor is a Jewish man, and the woman is married to another Jewish man. Is that going to be a mamzer? Because there has been insemination with another man's sperm while she is married to another Jewish man. So if that sperm, which fertilizes her egg, had been placed there in the normal manner, then that child would be a mamzer. I refer you back to what I said earlier of Rabbi Moshe Tendler. Rabbi Moshe Tendler's opinion, which is the widely held opinion, is that adultery cannot be committed with a hypodermic syringe. It has to be committed in the normal marital fashion. So that does not preclude artificial insemination. So we also mentioned, and one of the groups that I joined in was discussing the issue of anonymous donation of eggs, an anonymous donation of sperm, and that can lead to halachic problems. The Western society morals are not too bothered about this because the chances of it happening are very, very slim. But if you had anonymous donors and two children who were both born by IVF met and decided to get married, it could turn out that they are half brothers, or can't be half brothers if they're getting married. Well, actually, they could be half brothers if they're getting married today, but that's not what I'm talking about. They'd be half brother and half sister. And then you would have a problem of incest, because a half brother and a half sister is not half incest, it's full incest. So that's a potential halachic problem. Paul Westbrook pointed out in his group that today we can get around that because we can do genetic testing. So if that scenario, we can do DNA testing. So if that scenario was to arise today, that we had two IVF children from artificial insemination, two artificially inseminated children were to come together, we could do DNA testing and we could know for almost certainty that these were not brother and sister, and it would be okay. But until recently with the DNA testing, that was a problem that the rabbis considered far, far more of a problem than did Western society. And there were, in the early days of assisted fertility, there were many, many rabbis who, in fact, the majority of rabbis who forbade artificial insemination by donor for exactly that reason, that you did not know who the father was. Nachum is waving at me. Can it wait, Nachum, till I'm gone through the end? If you can wait till... No, you can't wait. Okay, you can't wait. All right, go on then.
I can wait. I can wait.
Oh, you can wait. Okay,
it was
good.
relevant.
Well, you can be first on.
It was relevant.
Okay, you can be first on. You can be first on when we finish, because I want to finish going through these halachic problems, and then those of you that want to leave can leave, and those of you who want to stay can stay. Right, so sperm donation, we've talked about non-Jewish donor, it is permissible. What about the Jewish status of the child? The Jewish status of the child depends, of course, on who is the mother, not on who is the father. So if you're going to say that the birth mother is the mother, then the status of the halachic Jewish status goes by the birth mother. If you're going to say it's genetic, then it's the genetic mother. If you're going to say it's both, then you could end up having a half Jewish child, as we said before. But the majority of poskim, in terms of the Jewish status, the majority of the poskim hold that the Jewish status is given over by the birth mother. So in other words, the majority of poskim would say that a genetically non-Jewish child, in other words, that the egg, even the sperm, it doesn't matter, sperm's irrelevant because it goes from the mother, but you get an egg from a non-Jewish woman, and you implant that fertilized egg into a Jewish woman, and the Jewish woman gives birth to that child, most of the poskim will hold that that child is Jewish. There are some who hold that they're not sure and therefore would want gerut l'chumra, but the majority hold that it's the Jewish status is conferred, that's the word I was looking for before, is conferred on the child by the birth mother, because it's a Jewish woman that gives birth to the child. By the way, there's an interesting concept when we, maybe in the next course, if we ever talk about cloning, which is another topic which is interesting. When Dolly the sheep was first cloned back in the 90s, I put together a presentation called How to Make a Kosher Pig, which is all halachic acrobatics to do with cloning, and you can actually make a properly 100% kosher pig that doesn't have choose the cud and doesn't, well, it does have cloven hooves because they do anyway, but doesn't have the 2 kosher signs. But with cloning, you can make a totally kosher pig because of this halachic acrobatics, and it's based on the fact that whoever gives birth to the offspring is the mother. And on that basis, the most of the rabbis hold that the birth mother confers the Jewish status on the child. What about a Kohen? What about a Kohen? So you have a man who is a Jewish man, a Kohen, who is married to a Jewish woman, and he has no sperm, and so they do artificial insemination by donor, and the woman gives birth to this child who is brought up by this father who's not his genetic father. He's not his birth father, because fathers don't give birth, not yet anyway. So is this child a Kohen or not? You'll not be surprised to know that most of the poskim say that this child is not a Kohen. However, there are 1 or 2 rather unusual approaches which go like this: that there is no such thing as adoption in Jewish law. There's no such concept, which is, by the way, another problem when we come to Yichud, when you talk about adopting children. That can be an issue for some people. But the approach here by some people is that a father who has taken on a child to bring him up from birth, as it were, takes on the status of that father, and that for the purposes of this child's life, he can be considered to be a Kohen because he is the son of his father. However, when he himself has children, it doesn't. The status of Kohen does not get passed on. In other words, he becomes almost like an honorary Kohen. It means very little today, because all it really means today is that he could get called up first to the Torah, and he could duchen. So there's not that much. It would have been much more important in times of the Beit HaMikdash, when you were talking about eating kodshim and getting the matnat kahuna, etc. But it's an interesting concept. It's almost a dat yochid. It's almost a one-off view, and it's a very minority view. But I just put it out there for completion. So there we go. Now, what else haven't we talked about? Testicular surgery. There, we talked about that earlier on, very briefly. Again, it's the same concept as the idea of procurement of sperm. This idea of krut shafcha, of a crushed testicle or an injured testicle. Many poskim forbid the procurement of tests or sperm or any kind of testicular tissue by operation or by needle, because it causes damage to the testicles. However, again, that's a moving opinion. Opinion is now coming more towards the idea that this is not the interpretation of the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted. This is not what we meant by that. And I bring you back to something that those of you who have attended my Tanakh shiurim will have heard me say hundreds of times, that we say in Sefer Dvarim 5 times we have the expression Va'asita et hatov vayashar b'einei Hashem. We started off this medical ethics course using that pasuk to make sure that we did the right things. The idea of that pasuk is, if the mitzvah doesn't feel right, that doesn't seem to fit with what is good and upright in the eyes of God, or what we think would be upright in the eyes of God, we need to go back and look again and see maybe there's a different interpretation of the halacha that fits better with tov v'yashar. And that's what's happened in paskening halacha in these circumstances. I'm going to finish now, but I just want to show you one thing from the more detailed sheet that I've provided. And that is right at the end of it. I want to show you what, if I can find it, what Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said. I don't know where it is now. Here we go. Here we go. Have a look at this. Have a look at this. In the box there, which says number 22, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the great poskim of the 20th century, said that he found a source in the voluminous rabbinic literature for every question that was posed to him, including all medical and technological advances. In other words, there was nothing that he could not find in the rabbinic literature or the Torah to support a view, a halachic view, one way or the other, about any question in the world, except for one, namely the question of determining motherhood in a surrogacy case. And Rav Shlomo Zalman was unable to do that, and he was, if he couldn't find it, then nobody could find it. And I just wanted to show you that, to show you how difficult a problem, Jewishly, ethically, this idea of assisted reproduction is. It's probably the most difficult one of all. I just want to finish now by telling you a little story, which doesn't really have a happy ending, I don't think. I have in my bookcase downstairs a book of essays on medical halacha. I collect these books. I've got loads of them. This was a book of essays that came out in the very early 1980s, just a few years after the birth of Louise Brown. And in it, there is an article by Rav Moshe Stern, who is a rabbi of the Eder Haredis in Jerusalem. And he writes a very, very scathing and very clear psak that IVF is completely and utterly forbidden. It was a new technique in those days, completely and utterly forbidden, and he gives a whole load of sources for his opinion. A few years ago, I think it must have been when I moved to Israel and I moved all my books over, I sort of refound this book in my bookcase and I reread it. And I came across this essay and I thought, wow, this really doesn't seem to fit in with modern day halacha, even modern day halacha in the Haredi world. I wonder if Rav Stern still holds the same opinion 40 years later. So I wrote to him and asked him, I quoted his essay and I quoted him and asked him if he still held of those opinions. And if he didn't hold of those opinions, how had they changed and what had made him change his opinion? It doesn't have a happy ending because I never got a reply, which is a bit of a shame because I strongly suspect that he doesn't hold those same views because the techniques have moved along, the information available has moved along, the understanding of what goes on has moved along. And we mentioned Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach just to finish. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach famously said at the end of his life that he did not understand why electricity should be forbidden to be used on Shabbat. And the reason he said that was because Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was somebody who availed himself of the greatest brains in every single subject. So when he was discussing medical issues, he had his Talmid Muvhag Rabbi, Professor Abraham, who was an expert. When he was discussing electricity, he would have a super duper expert on how electricity works with electrons and protons and this and that and the other. And when he understood it, at the end of his life, he understood how electricity now was understood. We thought electricity was fire going down a wire back in the day. When he understood that, he said, I don't know why it should be forbidden. Should we use it? No, we shouldn't use it because that's not what Jews do. But I don't understand why we should use it. In other words, he changed his views as with the science. And I suspect Rav Stern would do the same as well, but I never got an answer. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So those of you who've had enough, feel free to leave. Those of you who want to stay and who would like to discuss it and discuss the cases, please feel free to do that as well. I'm going to start with Nachum, who was waiting very patiently there to say what he wanted to say. Yes, Nachum.
Is there an obligation on the part of the parents to tell a child that he's a product of artificial insemination? Or is he not, are the parents not obligated to do that?
That's a very good question. Well, let's look at that question from an ethical point of view first, and then let's have a look and see what the Halacha might say. And I will refer you to last week's course, which was last week on truth telling, I think it was, or was that the week before? Anyway, we did 1 week on truth telling, and we found that in modern day Western ethics, telling people the truth, whether it may be harmful to them or not, seems to be the norm. And there has to be a very, very strong reason in modern Western medical ethics not to tell the truth. So I think that unless you could show that there would be serious harm caused to the child by telling them that, then I think Western ethics would say that you would be obliged to tell the child his origins. Now, that would have to be a decision that would be made on every individual case, because there may well be pressing reason why the child shouldn't be told. But absent such a pressing reason, modern ethics would say that you should tell the child. Now, what about Halacha? Well, as we saw last time with telling the truth, the Halacha is much more utilitarian in its approach, much more sort of taking the overall benefit into approach. It's not as black and white in terms of the truth must be the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Unfortunately, I think sometimes in Halacha, that is used as an excuse for hiding things that shouldn't be hidden. But I think in Halacha, you would probably be able to find much more leeway and much more sympathy for the idea of not telling the child. The reason being that if you were to tell the child, then there would be potential harm to that child psychologically. You would have to weigh it up in terms of what the problem was in terms of potential incest and those kind of things that we talked about before. But I think the halacha would be that there would not necessarily be a chiyuv to tell the person unless there was a good reason to do so. In other words, you could invoke the concept of shev v'al ta'aseh, which means unless there's a good reason to do something, then you sit v'al ta'aseh and don't do it. So if you have a dilemma in halacha, should I or shouldn't I? The default position is don't, unless there's a good reason to do so. Whereas in modern ethics, in that particular question that you've raised, it's the other way around. There has to be a good reason not to do so. It's a bit like opt-in and opt-out. So I think that's my view. Anybody else would like to comment on that?
If you don't tell, and your child is now an adult and wants to get married, are you then going to say, you're going to need a genetic test to see if you or your future bride is going to be a problem for you?
Well,
I mean, at some point,
if you think about it, Nachum, that's only going to be a problem if both parties, both the bride and the groom, are the product of donations.
Yeah, but maybe only one knows. The other one doesn't know anything about it.
No, what I'm saying is, if neither of them know, well, neither of them know. There's nothing you can do about it. If one of them knows, right, and the other one doesn't, then unless you're in that situation, I think that you would probably have an obligation to tell the child and to deal with it. So in other words, in a case like this, a man and a woman have a child through artificial insemination by donor, let's say, right? And the girl that he happens to meet and marry, they know is a child from an artificial insemination by donor. And she's been told and he hasn't. In that situation, you would have to tell. But that's going to be a very, very unusual situation. If neither of them know, then there's nothing to talk about because each one thinks that he is the product of both of his parents.
May I ask another question?
Yes.
Is there an obligation for a married couple who are not able to conceive, regardless of who's at fault, are they obligated to use this new scientific method to produce a child?
That's a very good question, Nachum. It's a good question. It's one that we didn't touch on because there wasn't time, but I think there's stuff in the more detailed sheet that I'll send out. There is a mitzvah in the Torah, pru uruvu, be fruitful and multiply. So the question you're asking me really is how far do you have to go to do that mitzvah? So you could ask that about any mitzvah, okay? So there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I know I'm asking the wrong person with you, Nachum, but how far do you have to go to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael? Are you obliged, as soon as it is possible for you to do so, to sell up wherever you are and move to Israel? Or is there a limit on how much effort you have to put into that mitzvah? What about the mitzvah of having a beautiful etrog? How far do you have to go to get a beautiful etrog? So it's all a question of degree. So the poskim are agreed that one has to try to have children. It's a mitzvah of pru uruvu. There is no obligation to do any of the things that we have talked about in halacha. It is considered mitzvah min hamuvchar in the same way as if you go and buy a grade 1 etrog, you have fulfilled the mitzvah. If you go and buy a grade A, well, then you've done the mitzvah to a higher degree. So you can argue that by doing all of these techniques, you're doing the mitzvah of pru uruvu. It's not in our hands whether we fulfill that mitzvah of pru uruvu. That's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All we can do is do what we're meant to do, and what we're meant to do is to try and have children in the natural way. So if you're telling, your question was, are you obligated to do these things? No, you are not obligated to do these things. Would it be considered meritorious to do so in order to fulfill the mitzvah? Yes, it would. Okay, Avril Links next, please. We can't hear you, Avril. You'll have to.
Yeah, I've unmuted. Can I just ask you, would a man fulfill the mitzvah of pru uruvu by sperm donation if he was the only sperm donor and there were offspring? Would he have fulfilled that mitzvah?
Okay, that's another question which is raised by the poskim as well. Just as you can't commit adultery at the end of a hypodermic syringe, the question is, can you fulfill the mitzvah of pru uruvu with a hypodermic syringe? In other words, you could even extend your question and say, the person who goes through the process of AID, okay, the man who doesn't have any sperm, he goes through the process, he pays for it, he pays for all these procedures to get somebody else's sperm, and he has a child. Has he fulfilled the mitzvah of pru uruvu? Because he has facilitated a child being born. So you could argue that actually they've both done it. The sperm donor has actually produced the child because that's the sperm, and the person who's gone to all the effort to do all that and paid for it, etc., has also fulfilled that mitzvah. And if you're asking me, I would say they both fulfill the mitzvah of pru uruvu. I certainly would not be saying to a man who has done everything that he possibly can to have a child naturally, finds that he doesn't have any sperm, and then goes to all that effort together with his wife to find sperm from somebody else and go through all that, etc. That is far more effort than the normal way of having a child. And if you're asking me whether you would find poskim who would say he's fulfilled that mitzvah, I don't know. Probably not is the answer. But if you're asking me philosophically, if I was a Kodesh Baruch Hu, would I put a tick in that box for him? Most definitely I would. Bathsheba.
Yeah, I have two things that I would like to talk about. One is just something that happened. My parents-in-law knew two couples who were married for 10 years and had not had children. They were advised to get divorced and remarry someone else. Each couple had children with the second partner. Sometimes there's just a misconnect with the couple.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a medical issue as well. Sometimes you can have a situation where the sperm is incompatible with the woman's vaginal secretions. In other words, you can have a situation whereby the sperm is perfectly normal sperm, the eggs are perfectly normal eggs, but the sperm can't get there because the secretions in the vaginal tract are toxic to that particular sperm, and they all die before they get to fertilize the egg. So the situation that you described is not common, but it's certainly well recognized in the medical literature.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask about is the idea of telling the truth. What if there's a medical issue and the parents cannot help medically, the parents cannot help the child? They have to tell him then that he's not really their child.
Yeah, that would be one of the circumstances that I mentioned earlier on when I said that you have a situation in halacha of shev v'al ta'aseh. Unless there is a reason to do it, you don't. But that, of course, means that if there is a reason to do it, then you do. I had a situation, a friend of mine, a friend of my parents, really. They had a son. They were Kohanim. There was this boy was a Kohen. He was my age, and he was engaged to be married to a girl. And it came to the to go just before the wedding to get all the paperwork in order, and it turns out that this girl was adopted, and she hadn't been told she was adopted, and she was adopted. She was born to non-Jewish parents and adopted by Jewish parents. So she'd been brought up as a Jewish child. She'd gone to a Jewish school, etc. All those things. So the Bet Din were very keen to and very accommodating to do a quick geirut so that she would, she was Jewish. She'd been brought up as Jewish. She wanted to be Jewish. She was everything Jewish except not born Jewish. The problem, of course, is that a Kohen cannot marry a convert. That's a halacha.
Whoa.
And so this marriage could not go ahead. They were given an option of doing something a bit tricky, and that is going off to a different place. And when you change your place, you can go to a place where you've never been a Kohen before and say, look, I can't be 100% sure that I'm a Kohen. I haven't got any proof that I come from Aaron a Kohen, and therefore I sort of denounce my kahuna, as it were. You can't do that if you've already duchened in a place and you've already, established yourself as a Kohen. Anyway, cut a long story short, they didn't want to do that, and they got married in the Reform shul. And so that was the way they did it, but that was their choice. But you can see that I tell you that story to demonstrate the problems that can arise if you don't tell when perhaps you should tell. So these questions need to be very carefully weighed. The potential consequences need to be weighed, and then a decision has to be made with advice taken. Joseph Berger.
Just have to unmute myself. Okay, I just wanted to make the comment in terms of the 10-year not having children. So this was halacha certainly codified in terms of halacha after 10 years that a couple should get divorced. But as far as I'm aware in recent years, and I remember that there was a tshuva, I believe, from a Diane Kaplan from the London-based inn, that if the couple do not want to get divorced, they want to stay together, that it is okay for them to stay together.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. That is the halacha. The halacha is that they do not have to get divorced. You're right in the poskim and in Chazal, it's spoken about that after 10 years. Basically, they're saying, well, if it ain't happened in 10 years, it ain't going to happen, and therefore you have an obligation to do pru uravu, and therefore you have an obligation to be divorced and go and marry somebody else. The halacha, certainly the mainstream halacha today, is not that way. There is no obligation to be divorced. Many people still, not many, some people still do in that scenario, and I've certainly heard of it. But you're right, I didn't know it was Diane Kaplan that gave that psak, but definitely that is a very well-known psak today, that halacha of being divorced after 10 years is no longer widely applicable. Anybody else want to comment? I can see Dawn has got a hand up there.
Johnny, what is the position with a pidyon bin and alt?
A pidyon ben and alt. Okay, so that's a very good question as well. Let's just we need to have a framework for what we're talking about here. Pidyon ben is the redemption of the firstborn. It is the firstborn of the mother. It's the firstborn of the mother, not the father. So, in other words, somebody who has a child from one wife, who then has another wife, and then that child is born to the second wife, and that's that second wife's first child. If all the features are correct, i.e. that child is a boy and it wasn't a cesarean section and neither of them are a Kohen or a Levi, then that child will have a pidyon ben. It goes on the birth mother. Now, if you're going to say to me, well, what if it's a genetically non-Jewish child? Then we've still got the same, it boils down to the same issue of who is the mother. So if you take the opinion that says the mother is the birth mother, then it's the birth mother. If you say the mother is the genetic mother and the birth mother is just an incubator, well then pidyon ben doesn't come into it. And if you say it's both mothers, then you would probably have to do a pidyon ben lechumra. But it's a good question. I like that question. I might put that in as a case next time. Anybody else? Before I come to you, Nachum, I want to see if there's anybody else. Give them a chance first, and then I'll come back to you. Vivian Simonoff.
Sorry, what's it in actually?
Johnny, my question relates to a memory, which I suspect is now a false memory, of you giving a shir many, many years ago and talking about a surrogate mother who's not Jewish, but who has been impregnated with the egg from a Jewish woman. And my memory, which I suspect now is false, was you saying something like, if a cow is born in a stable, is it a horse?
I don't remember saying such a thing, but I may well have said such a thing, because that refers back to what I referred to earlier on with, how to make a kosher pig. Because not to let you into too much of a secret in case I decide to give you this share one day, is the way you make a kosher pig is you get a cow to give birth to the pig. So I may well have said such a thing, and in fact, the basis of that is what was probably then many years ago the mainstream halacha, which was that the birth mother is the mother. And as I said to you earlier on, it's a moving thing, and it has moved along. And most of the poskim today are sort of of the view that the child has two mothers, because they understand that it's wrong somehow. It's not Tova Yashar B'nei Hashem that a genetic mother should not be considered to be a mother. On the other hand, it's not considered Tova Yashar B'nei Hashem, the woman who's carried this baby for 9 months and gone through labor should not be considered to be the mother. So this idea of having 2 mothers sits very nicely with my obsession with Tova Yashar B'nei Hashem, because what the poskim are doing in effect is they're looking at things and saying, hang on, this doesn't feel right. It can't be. We need to find a solution that fits this and a solution that fits that. And it's an amazing thing when you think about it, that the big rabbis in this field will sit down and discuss it and come up with such a revolutionary idea that actually a child can have 2 mothers. Now, it doesn't sound very revolutionary to you, maybe, but it is. How can a child have 2 mothers? And when we get to talk about cloning one day, we'll do in the next medical ethics course, we'll do cloning. When we talk about cloning, I've got a bigger question for you. Who's the father? Right? Because when you clone somebody, right, if we were to take a cell of you, Vivian, and we were to clone you, who would be the father of your clone? Would it be you, because you're the mother and the father, because the whole genetic material is yours? So maybe you're the father, maybe the mother's the father, or maybe your father's the father because it's his genetic. It's a minefield, which is one of the reasons why the halachists are not very keen on the whole concept of cloning. But you can see just by the questions that I've raised that the poskim are putting their heads around completely new stuff, which is why Reb Shlomo Zalman was humble, and he really was Onov Mikola Odom, Reb Shlomo Zalman. He was humble enough to say, I can't figure this out. I don't know, because there's no precedent for it. So if there's no precedent, you have to go back to basics, and basics are Tova Yashar B'nei Hashem. What seems right? If it doesn't seem right, it isn't right. Go back and think again, and let's come up with a solution that is right. Now, sometimes that solution could be revolutionary, which is you've got 2 mothers, or you've got no father, or you've got 2 fathers, or wherever it may be. So I may well have said such a thing many years ago, because at that time, the vast majority of poskim would have said that the birth mother is the mother and the genetic mother is not. We've moved a bit away from that. Michael Kraus, please.
Right. You were talking before about the Pidyon Aben. What if the father of that particular relationship is a Cohen? Would there still be a Pidyon Aben under those circumstances?
Do you mean the father who's not the genetic father?
Or say, to start off with, that the mother's not the genetic mother, and then look at the other way around.
So you've got so whose is the sperm?
The sperm, in the first instance, the sperm is from the father, but the mother is not the genetic mother, but she gives birth, and you've said that a lot of the poskim say that she is actually
okay, but if the father is a Kohen, if the genetic father is a Kohen, then there's no Pidyon Aben anyway, because he's a Kohen.
Yeah, but so would there still be, under those circumstances, there would not be a Pidyon Aben? That's what I'm trying to find out.
Because the genetic father is a Kohen.
Yeah, so it depends on the geneticism of the father.
Because because if either the father is a Kohen or a Levi, or the mother is a Bat Kohen or Bat Levi, there's no Pidyon Aben anyway.
Okay. What about the other situation where the sperm is donated and the father's a Kohen?
In that case, there probably would need to be a Pidyon Aben, because that child is not halachically related to that father in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else before we call it a day? Last one, Nachum, Brian, and then Nachum, and then I'm gagging for a cup of tea, so it'll have to be last 2. Go on, Brian.
Well, surely the surrogate mother
should not be considered the mother. She was the conduit or the incubator, never intended to be the mother. And the child has the DNA of the donor of the egg. So why should the surrogate mother be considered as the mother?
Okay. Let me say this in the nicest possible way, Brian. That question could only come from a man. Let me ask Rochelle, who Bli Ayin Hara has carried a number of children, what she thinks about that comment. Rochelle, what do you think about that? Unmute yourself, Rochelle.
What do I think about that? It takes a lot to carry the children. The DNA is not just part, it's not the only part of it, as Laura said, as we were discussing this in our group. So yeah.
That's a very, I think us fellas can never really appreciate how it feels to carry a baby, to have that thing growing inside you, to have that thing being fed from what you fed, from your blood. You are giving life to that child. So I think that it's something that we men can't really get a grasp on. You're right, in absolute bold terms on a piece of paper, most people would agree with you. But life isn't like that. You know, you've got this emotional attachment. You've got this physical attachment. This child, as you brought this child, forget the pains they've got to go through to labor to get the thing out. Just the 9 months of carrying this thing and feeding it and throwing up the whole time, and you know, all the stuff that we fellas don't have to go through, Baruch Hashem. And I can see Rochelle smiling and nodding. And I think I've probably hit the right answer there for that question, Brian. Okay.
Could I mention something?
Who's speaking?
It's Batsheva. It's Batsheva. Could I mention
something? Yes, go ahead, Batsheva.
There was an incident where the daughter could not carry, so her mother carried the child. So the grandmother gave birth to the grandmother gave birth to her grandson.
Yeah.
Now where does that come in? Okay, it has nothing to do with Jewish. It just the situation.
So you have the grandmother who is also the mother in that situation.
Yeah.
It's a difficult problem. It's a difficult problem. The problem there is if the carrying the baby is not so much a problem. There is a potential halachic problem of a donor. So let's say you have a situation whereby a woman needs an egg donor, and the donor is her sister, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, you've got a potential issue of mamzerut. Because a man cannot marry his wife's sister while his wife is still alive.
Oh, wow.
And so therefore, we then have to invoke Rabbi Tendler by saying you can't commit adultery at the end of a needle, meaning that it would, most people would be allowed. But many rabbis would say if you can find an egg donor who is not in one of the forbidden categories, it is better to do so. Okay, I'm gonna finish now with Nachum, wherever he is. There he is. Nachum, you get the last word.
In this modern day we live in, it's not unusual to have a man and a man marry and have a child that doesn't actually come from that normal relationship. That's not a normal relationship. The same thing happens with women who don't get married, but they find someone to donate sperm, and they're never married. What's the Jewish position on homosexuality and bringing children into the world?
Okay. So the first thing to say is that two men who decide to have a child through egg donation. So one of them has sperm, and they take the sperm. By the way, what they sometimes do, and this is halachically completely unacceptable, but what happens today is you'll get two guys who are in a relationship who decide they want to have a child together. Now, obviously, only you need an egg and a sperm for a child, and these guys have only got sperm, they haven't got eggs. So what they do is they both produce sperm, they mix them together, right? So we don't actually know. I mean, they probably will know later on because it'll look like one and not look like the other. But in effect, they mix their sperms together, and they use that mixture of sperm to inseminate a donor egg, and then they have a surrogate to have the baby. So then they have this child which has two fathers officially and a surrogate mother. Now that's what happens in practice. Halachically, that would be completely forbidden, because the concept of procuring sperm to do artificial insemination, we've said that many rabbis believe it is not expressing seed for nothing, but that is only on the basis of a normal man-woman relationship. You would not be able to invoke that halacha and say, well, this is not levatala, because that is not a normal, natural relationship al pi Torah. It would be, I think you would find no Orthodox rabbi that would permit what you are suggesting, either way, for a homosexual male couple or a homosexual female couple. Halachically, that would not be something that would be sanctioned. Okay, I'm going to call a halt there. We still have 24 of you out of 45. So that shows that more than half of you are still with us after 2 hours. So you've got staying power, you guys. Well done. We've got 2 more weeks left. We are going to tackle, please God, next week and the week after. I'm going to split it into 2 because it's absolutely impossible to do it in one session. And that is going to be end-of-life issues, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicides, and all that kind of gear. Withdrawal of nutrition, all that kind of stuff. That's going to be in the next two weeks. There may be a hiatus in between because I'm going to go to England, please God, and there are various things going on which may cause me to have to cancel one of the sessions, but it won't be cancelled. It will be postponed at worst, and I'll do it later. But I'm hoping that won't be the case. And I'm hoping that the next 2 weeks we'll do euthanasia. Avril will very kindly send out the recording of this marathon together with the 2 documents that I will send to her, the summary one which we've gone through here, and this fancy one which has got a lot more information on it over there. So on that point, I wish you a very good night and a Shavua Tov.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good night.
Very, very good.
Johnny, it's not called staying power. It's called interest. Interesting. You make it so interesting. That's why we stay here.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating, I would say.
Thank you for the positive feedback.
Oh, it was amazing.
Really great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Good night. It was wonderful.
See you tomorrow morning.
I need to send the thing out that we're still doing it on Wednesday. I forgot to do that. I'll do it right now.
All
Thank you.
right. Good thing I reminded you then.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I meant to do that earlier today, but I forgot.
Yeah, 8:15?
For you, yes.
Oh, right. Sorry, 10:15 for you. Okay, fine. Thank you.